From Tbilisi. My name is Sonja Schiffers, and I'm the director of the Heinrich Boell Foundation Tbilisi Office, South Caucasus Region. I would like to welcome you to the webinar EU-Armenia Relations, Harnessing the Momentum. In his address at the European Parliament in October 2023, Prime Minister Pashinyan stated that Armenia is ready to be closer to the European Union as much as the European Union considers it possible. The European mission in Armenia was recently expanded, and the EU and Armenia have begun to intensively discuss potential next steps in their relationship. Yet, how much integration does the EU indeed consider possible in the long term, and what is practically feasible in the short and medium term remains to be seen. Which cooperation path would benefit Armenia and the Armenians most, and what can the EU deliver, particularly in light of the pressing security challenges facing Armenia and the region? We will discuss these and other questions with our speakers for today. Welcoming remarks will be provided by His Excellency Dirk Schübel, EU Special Envoy for the Eastern Partnership at the European External Action Service. And we have excellent panelists, Ambassador Tigran Balayan, the Head of Mission of the Republic of Armenia to the European Union, Viola von Kramon, Member of the European Parliament, Marie Dumoulin, Director of the Wider Europe Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Anahit Filibosyan, Vice President of Strategy and Development at APRI Armenia. This discussion will be held in a webinar format, so the audience can send their questions, and you're invited to send your questions via the Q&A tool. Feel free to do this from the beginning of the webinar, and we will take them up as soon as possible. And yeah, your questions will only be visible after they have been answered. And the webinar is held in English without translation. Let's proceed to the welcoming remarks. Ambassador Schübel, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador, dear Tigran. Good morning, dear Member of Parliament, dear Ms. von Kramon, dear friends of Armenia. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to address this meeting today. Very happy to see EU-Armenia relations flourishing. But before I get there, I wanted to start perhaps with a little bit of the bigger picture, a little reference to the European Council meeting in December, where really enormously important decisions were taken, as you all know. So both Ukraine and Moldova have been given the green light to start accession negotiations in the near future. And I think we're about to launch the screening process for both. Georgia has become a candidate country, very important, I think, also for Armenia, that another country of the Southern Caucasus is moving towards Europe in the what we believe right direction. And I think it is very good to see that Armenia is kind of using the tailwind, if I may say so, of this decision, and is also making efforts to moving closer to the European Union, a step that we obviously very much welcome. This could also be seen already in the margins of the European Council meeting, namely at the Foreign Affairs Council meeting a few days earlier, where there was a breakfast meeting of the members of the FAC with Foreign Minister Mirzoyan, apart from what you have mentioned already, the discussions that was held in October 2023. We also got very positive remarks from the Armenian side at the Eastern Partnership Ministerial, which was in between the meetings that I just mentioned. So also there, we believe that Armenia is a very important and reliable member of the Eastern Partnership, which of course should be also serving as a tool to help bringing bilateral relations forward between Armenia and the European Union. So relations are clearly developing on a positive track. We are currently looking for options to strengthen and deepen our relations with Armenia, as we were tasked also by the October European Council meeting, following the discussion with Prime Minister Pashinyan. And then there was a mission that took place, a joint mission, EAS, European Commission, at the end of November. And stemming from that, a number of options are currently looked at what we could do. The most important thing is probably that we are trying to create a new partnership agenda for our bilateral relations. That would be an upgrade of the existing EU-Armenia partnership priorities. And we have the idea to strengthen our cooperation in three main areas. First, sectoral cooperation in the areas which are important for Armenia's socio-economic resilience. Secondly, boosting our security and defense cooperation, very much in both sides' interest. And three, stepping up in investments, which will also be very important. A few examples for the three areas. On sectoral cooperation, obviously, we're thinking in helping Armenia to further diversify their trade. We are thinking of energy and transport cooperation. We are thinking, of course, in particular also of Eastern Partnership related regional connectivity increasing. That is important. And we are discussing also internally, we see whether we could not launch a visa liberalization action plan similar to what has been done for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia a couple of years ago. On security and defense cooperation, you mentioned already in your introductory words the EU mission in Armenia. Soon there is the first anniversary, the first birthday of the existence of the mission. And just recently, we have also decided to increase the staff by half, basically, from 138 to 209. I think that's also a very important step to strengthen stability in the region and security, and it's very much appreciated by the Armenian side. We also look into the request by Armenia to provide some funds under the European Peace Facility. Discussions are ongoing. I cannot advance these discussions right now. On investments, as you know, there has also been, following the visit in end of November, it was decided to set up an investment coordination platform that is in order to create even more impetus for future investments, of course, as a complement also to the European Economic and Investment Plan, of which Armenia anyway has already profited about 500 billion euros, if I'm not mistaken. So all of this, all these developments, of course, all our positive steps could be much easier taken and would be much more useful if we had a peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There, let me say that the EU remains fully committed to this peace treaty, to the talks. Also, we are acting there as neutral brokers. And yes, the last trilateral meeting or a meeting with EU bodies is lasting a few months back, but the EU stands ready to help out again if both sides so wish, and we do hope very much that we get into the normalization process, which leads into a peace treaty, which then would open the doors for completely different possibilities, I think, also for Armenia in our bilateral contacts. A few issues also following the events. We have tried to help, of course, the terrible situation of the people from Nagorno-Karabakh who went in their vast majority to Armenia, and we have provided help totaling altogether more than 12 million euros, both in terms of mobilizing our civil protection mechanism. There already almost 10.5 million euros have been mobilized, and also, of course, also pure humanitarian support for those who are suffering and who had to leave the area. 1.7 million euros has been provided there. And then there's also a humanitarian package under the EU for Peace program, which has been topped up with another 800,000 euros, which I think is also worthwhile mentioning, that we stand by the people who had to leave the area and who need to find a new home there now in Armenia. Obviously, we have an agreement which exists. That's the Comprehensive and Enhanced Partnership Agreement. I had the pleasure to also negotiate parts of this agreement, so I know it fairly well. It's very ambitious. It is not an association agreement, but it's not so far away. And now, of course, through the measures that I mentioned before in the EU-Armenia partnership agenda, we will try to get our cooperation a bit closer to what an association agreement would have been like. I mentioned also already the Economic and Investment Plan. There are shared strategic priorities. I mentioned already the energy sector. There is a certain energy well, we're trying to help Armenia to become energy independent or more energy independent from one big supplier that we all know. Trade diversification, digital agenda, I think another important topic where we can cooperate, and social economic development along the lines that I also started mentioning. Last but not least, let me also mention one more time the Eastern Partnership as special envoy. That's of course very dear to my heart. There, I think again we are very pleased with Armenia's participation there and active participation. Regional connectivity is obviously in Armenia's own interest, and it has been mentioned by all sides many times. So we're trying to see also what projects we have in mind in terms of connectivity through the Black Sea, the cables that have been envisaged, whether there's a possibility to link them also to Armenia in one way or another. We have also agreed at the last Eastern Partnership Ministerial in December on a regional roaming agreement. I think that will also be very helpful for those who are connecting, those Armenians who are connecting inside the region of the Eastern Partnership and with the EU member states. I think that is also a very clear step forward. Security cooperation was already mentioned. Also, that is, of course, a top priority under the Eastern Partnership, and we stand by. So altogether, to conclude, I think it is a good time for EU-Armenia relations. We are very happy to see these developments and that things are moving in the right direction. We stand ready, as here in the EAS, but also in the European Commission, to make the most out of it and to get Armenia as close as possible to the EU with the possibilities that exist in the current framework. And with this, I think your event is a very timely event. Congratulations to this, and I wish all participants a very lively and interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Schübel. And yeah, indeed, a very ambitious agenda and a lot of topics to discuss. I would like to give the floor to Heinrich. APRI Armenia has just 2 weeks ago published a paper report on EU-Armenia relations in cooperation with the Heinrich Boell Foundation South Caucasus Office, Armenia Office. And I would like to ask you whether your findings align with what Ambassador Schübel just outlined, or have you found anything else that could be further developed in EU-Armenia relations?
Thank you, Sonia. Delighted to take part in this discussion with such respected panelists and present our research. I think in many ways, the EU's role and action in Armenia and the South Caucasus are actually a good reflection of the challenges the EU faces between its foreign policy aspired role and the actual means it has to achieve that role. So I think the report is also quite helpful to those who are looking at EU's foreign policy in general. So the research was done over the 2 months of last year, and consisted of desktop research and 15 interviews of key stakeholders in the Armenian government, EU institutions, European diplomats, and civil society representatives. And it just occurred when the official statements were made and when the fact-finding mission was dispatched. So it was quite an interesting environment. I will highlight 5 things, and Sonia, to answer shortly. There are many things overlapping, and there are things that we've also pinpointed that can be done more, and I'll mention those. The first finding is the institutional patchwork that frames EU-Armenia relations that His Excellency has provided. We have 3 elements: the bilateral agreement, the Eastern Partnership framework, and the novelty is indeed the security dimension, and that is why we have the resurgence. So I will not go through this. But what our research revealed is that many found the SEPA to be actually what it was called an association agreement light. So I would agree with you, Your Excellency. And actually more efforts can be put into its full implementation. But where there is a need to reform is indeed the Eastern Partnership. It needs to stay, it has to be rethought to be fit for purpose. It's supposed to be a multilateral framework bringing on the one roof the Europe's Eastern neighborhood. But for its 2.0 remake, our research revealed that the best areas to reform it would be to focus on civic reforms within the partner countries, connectivity, and you mentioned it, Your Excellency, and transport. And these are all areas that would actually help to regional peace. The second finding is what we call the domestic sticks, colloquially, and that means that the Armenian government can put more effort in fully implementing the SEPA, especially the reforms, domestic reforms inscribed in the SEPA, but it does need support. The EU can set higher expectations, but also perhaps can provide greater support, for example, through capacity building initiatives. And the Armenian civil society also has a role to play in really supporting the implementation of the reforms. The third finding is what we call the security stakes, and that the EU's recent engagement with Armenia is intertwined with the EU's relationship with Azerbaijan. Indeed, the overall momentum of EU-Armenia relations is very positive and commendable, and you went through, the various measures, Your Excellency. But also, we also are very much conscious that the effects of these measures will take place over the medium to long term, and they don't really address Armenia's immediate concerns and priorities, which is, the risk of military escalation. And yes, indeed, there are elements related to security in the new emerging EU-Armenia relations, but the root causes of these additions are not really addressed by the EU, or you can see it's been addressed through statements. For example, one by Josep Boell, the High Representative, on the 21st of September, saying the EU stands ready to take appropriate actions in the event of a further deterioration of the situation. Deterioration did occur, but we did not see the actions. So it does raise questions on the value of these statements, however well-intended they are. And we have seen how also Azerbaijan has rejected the invitations to the Granada summit and Brussels since then. So to better address the root causes that triggered the security dimension of the relationship, we think the EU can do two things. One is to act on its statements in the future, and also introduce conditionality in the future relations with Azerbaijan. And that would make the EU stronger and perhaps bring Azerbaijan to a more constructive attitude in the Brussels format. And what Armenia can do is also diversify its security architecture. You may know that now 90% of Armenia's defense procurements are coming from India and 10% from France. So that diversification is already happening. The fourth finding, we have 5 in total, so I'll be fast, is that the EU-Armenia relations cannot be looked in isolation, and why the regional dynamics matter. And so our research pointed out that Armenia's relations with Russia does influence EU-Armenia relations, but only to a certain extent. There are limits to the strengthening due to Armenia's membership in the Eurasian Economic Union and the CSTO. We have the CEPA because back in 2013, Armenia pulled out from the association agreement negotiations, allegedly because Russia pressured Armenia to do so. And now we know that the strengthening can not occur, for example, when it comes to free trade, but also when it comes to support. So there are clear boundaries in the strengthening because of the the Armenia-Russia relations or historical alliances. But the prevailing view from the interviews we conducted was that the strengthening is not really an act towards Russia or to diminish Russia's influence in the region, but rather a step to strengthen Armenia and making more resilient and harder to challenge is its security in light of repeated aggression against Azerbaijan. And so moving away to the other neighbors, our interviews indicated that the EU understands the complex relationship that Armenia has with both Iran and Turkey. And when it comes to Georgia, I would agree with you, Your Excellency. Indeed, now that Georgia has EU candidate status and Turkey too, the prospect of lasting stability in a region that could potentially border the EU has increased the importance for the EU to help reduce the risk of military aggression. Last findings, and I'll wrap up, is that it's become quite clear from our research that both the EU and Armenia lack a clear foreign policy vision. The EU's foreign policy in the South Caucasus is at times contradictory. On the one hand, you have on its agenda principles of good governance, promotion of democracy, and protection of human rights. And on the other hand, we have seen how shorter-term energy interests have taken precedence over these values. And so really the EU would benefit from a strategic and coherent vision instead of relying on reactive measures. And we believe the reforms on the Eastern Partnership can really help shape that vision. And Armenia can actually take greater agency in its cooperation with the EU and think of better articulating its vision and path to the EU, but also its citizens. So the report was hyperlinked in the webpage, and it's available on our website if you're interested. It includes many recommendations that are addressed to Armenian and EU policymakers. I'll stop there, Sonia.
Thank you very much, Anahid. Ambassador Balayan, what do you make of the report and the findings, and what are, from an Armenian perspective, from the official Armenian perspective, the priorities on this big list of items, of agenda items? And maybe you could also already touch upon the first question posed about SEPA and SEPA implementation. What are the stumbling blocks in this regard? Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank Heinrich Boell Foundation for hosting this series of events. I had the pleasure to attend also the launching conference in Yerevan. Of course, I read the report. It is kind of not only the analysis, but as Anahid has put it, it also recommendations and very concrete recommendations what should be done from the experts' point of view. And this, of course, this is something that we take into account, not only in the foreign ministry, but wider in the Armenian government. And I see many friendly faces here. I mean, Madame von Kramon and the Ambassador Boell are those people who are really staunchly supporting this rapprochement with Europe. And but here I would like to challenge my good friend Ambassador Schubert on this is kind of not pivot towards EU, towards the West. What we see this transformation in Armenia's policy, we prefer to call it, and it is exactly like that, it's pivot towards Armenian national interests. Rapprochement with Europe is the natural Armenian national interests for the moment being. You have started, dear Sonia, from the quote from my Prime Minister of October, from a speech in October at the European Parliament, and I would like to thank also MEP von Kramon for also being one of the initiators of inviting my Prime Minister to the plenary. That was really a historic event with a lot of messages. But I would quote also Prime Minister from yesterday. Anna had already mentioned some part of it that said, "Now we are living in new realities in the region." 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the situation was completely different. We have now 2 neighbor countries out of 4 who are EU candidate countries. And we have to take this reality and not face it, but also benefit from it. And this is how we see the trajectory of our relationship with the European Union. I mean, European Union came close to Armenia. European Union is already in the region by granting Georgia status of the candidate status. And you also saw our reaction, very positive reaction to the granting of this candidate status to Georgia. Then, of course, Ambassador Schubert touched a lot on the content of the upcoming events and also the intensity of the contents we had and tangible results we have registered for last year. Unfortunately, I have to say that this opening in the European Union, we saw after the complete ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh. 10 or 20 people that stayed in Nagorno-Karabakh, it's not the minority that stayed. There is basically the people who stayed, they cannot move. And this is something that also is a result of, as you have told, kind of a mix or inconsistency of the policy towards Caucasus. Yes, we heard HRVP Boell at the UN Security Council session. We appreciate that very much, and very clear statements and warnings. But after that, we had again threats, we had actions, we had another bunch of very strong statements from HRVP Boell last month, but we see that those statements are continuing. And our approach is that EU should not condition its relationship with Armenia with progress on the peace track with Azerbaijan, but on contrary, should do everything to show Azerbaijan that Armenia is not alone, Armenia will not abandon, and there is a full support to Armenia, to Armenia's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, as much support as Ukraine is enjoying now in the European Union. The situation we are facing now is exactly the same. We are threatened a conquest, not only by Azerbaijan, but also by its allies. Just 3 examples. All the CBMs, confidence building measures, we have proposed for last weeks, all of them were rejected and even mocked. Let's take non-aggression pact. Let's take mutual control of arms. Let's take this mirror withdrawal of forces from the bordering areas. All of them were rejected. Then I will also touch the security dimension, of course. EU-MR is the best thing that happened to the region since 2008, when a similar mission was deployed in Georgia. We are very grateful for its expansion, and also expansion not only in the numbers of the observers, but also in the capacity and the number of patrols. There are recommendations from civil society also how to make EU-MR more operational. We welcome those recommendations, of course. Then I would like to touch also on 2 issues, like we have held 2 sessions of security dialogue last year, in January and in November, which is the take-off stock of the security relationship and our understanding of each other's security and vulnerabilities. EPF is in the making. We still need the agreement of the member states. That's why I agree with Ambassador Schubel. We are not going to dive into the details. Let's wait what EIS is coming with a proposal, and then how the member states are reacting. Visa liberalization dialogue, it's long overdue. And here I see again kind of a contradiction. The same council decision that green-lighted EPF, green-lighted the opening of the visa liberalization dialogue as well. That was the same council decision. For the moment being, we have big progress on EPF, but on VLD we have nothing. So today I'm meeting a high-ranking official of DG Home. I hope to get some information where we are and how we are going to move to that. Coming to economic, helping Armenia to transform its economy and being more closer by the standards, etc., to the European Union. This is something that's very important, and here I connect with the implementation of SIPA. The major problem Armenia is facing is the lack of capacity, especially among civil servants. So I think this is the major issue that we should be helped to address by our friends and partners in the European Union. This is the cornerstone of this is our weakest point, basically. On that sense, I would say that there are a number of tools that we can have. TIEX, twinning, there are trainings that can be organized by a number of institutions like European Institute for Public Administration, College of Europe, etc. So we are working with the European colleagues on that. And I would like to also thank Ambassador Schubel for helping us in getting there. it's not even about training, you know, of civil servants. It's full reshaping, retraining, starting from very basic knowledge of how these laboratories should be operated, and from the quality standards, what quality standards should be applied. And this is something that is the basis of SIPA. SIPA is a constitution of our relationship. And this is something that we want to have as soon as possible. First of all, we cannot have it now. We cannot proceed with the full implementation because of the lack of capacity. And that was mentioned in the question, by the way. Yeah, Black Sea electricity cable. This is the flagship initiative of Georgia. And we saw that Armenia was left out due to efforts of a particular country. And we would like to see Armenia rejoins this project as a precondition for other countries to join the project. Here, I would like also to mention the Crossroads of Peace, which is our vision of the future of the region and Armenia's role in that future. Yesterday, I read what concerns assistance and the needs of the refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh. On Nagorno-Karabakh, I have to mention that EU, we advise that at least, and we request our EU partners should make on Nagorno-Karabakh, should make one of the cornerstones of its regional policy, full implementation of the ICJ decisions. If we are for the international legal order, legally binding orders of the ICJ are the part of international legal order. This is something that should be taken very seriously, I suppose. Coming back to the economy transformation and EU assistance in helping us on infrastructure projects. Yesterday, I read very good news that EU is allocating 400 million euros to address the needs of Turkey for post-earthquake recovery. So I think if there is a political will to find more funds for addressing very urgent needs, the money can be found. And in this context, and I'm finishing here, we look forward to the holding of this EU-US joint event on assisting to Armenia, as was mentioned in the Granada statement of Prime Minister Pashinyan and President von der Leyen. We cannot disclose details, but we hope to have this event organized in spring. Thank you very much again, and I'm ready to answer the questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Balayan. Let's move to Viola von Kramon. I would like to ask you the same question. What do you make of the findings of the report? Where do you see the priorities for EU-Armenia relations in the close future, and maybe also a long-term vision? And maybe you could also touch upon two of the important issues that were mentioned, SEPA implementation and the lack of capacity. You have worked in many countries, or focused on many countries that went through similar transformation processes. What do you think could be learned maybe from capacity building, for example, in Ukraine and Georgia, in the Balkans? Is there something to learn for Armenia? And of course, visa liberalization, what's the parliament's position on some of these issues, and how can the parliament maybe push more for strengthening of EU-Armenia relations?
Well, thank you so much, Sonia, and to the whole team of HBS for organizing this online debate. I think it's very timely, and it's good that you assembled this perfect experts here the morning to come up with new ideas and to maybe reconsider some of the former let's say agreements. I would say that first of all, we should not repeat what we have done with Russia. We see that Aliyev and Azerbaijan becomes more and more economically and military strong, dominant, but also very much not binding to any multilateral agreements. Neither is it the Council of Europe or is it an agreement with the European Union, has no interest whatsoever in a sustainable peace agreement. I think we have to consider that even the civil mission was increased, and that is a very important fact. Ambassador Schübel has mentioned that, 209 staff now. Well, that's okay, but still we have no security guarantee for Armenia. And we see that Aliyev, with his so-called elections yesterday, was even encouraged to go further. And we have not diminished our energy dependency from Azerbaijan. When it comes to Azerbaijan, everyone in the European Union, starting from the head of the president of the Commission to many of the head of states, are very, very quiet because we need each and every cubic meter of gas, and that is extremely worrying. So our dependency on gas weakens the security of Armenia, and I think this needs to be much more formulated, and there we need I think a solution which we have not found. On the contrary, we have even tightened our energy relations. Yes, we have started to come up with more sector cooperation, and that's good, and that was all mentioned, energy, transport, and so on. I think there's nothing to criticize, but nevertheless, security stays out. And nobody, even France, speaks about buying weapons. Yes, that might be a homeopathic dose of weapons, but even here, logistic-wise, transport-wise, it's not really clear how to transfer the weapons to Armenia. I think Pashinyan is, for me, to be honest, I don't speak in this terminology normally, but he's a hero. I mean, a country which is so close to Russia and which depends on to 89–90% economically wise from Russia, and takes this bold steps and says, well, first of all, we are not really interested in the CSTO, and we become a member of the ICC, is something you would not expect from anyone living in this neighborhood. So I think he deserves a lot of appreciation from our side, and he is really somebody who understands why it is necessary to emancipate from this toxic neighborhood and this toxic political society. So we, I think, as the European Union took some steps, and the European Parliament, I think, is always on the forefront of those steps, we have encouraged the European Commission and the ESS and also the European Council to go further with the visa lip. I think that is absolutely crucial to show to the people that they are welcomed. I know that France is not in favor, and that is extremely, I think, disappointing for me, while France is always like the advocate of Armenia on the European stage. But when it comes to concrete deeds, France is not in favor. And also here, this contradictory behavior, I think, needs to be better explained to the people in Armenia. I would say that the capacity building, of course, we can learn from the situation in Ukraine and Georgia, but we have a huge advantage in Armenia. We do not have political will for capacity building in Georgia, for example. So it is really hard to come up in a country where you have I would say the resistance from the ruling party, the resistance from the government towards more integration into the EU market, towards more integration into the EU institution. That is not the case in Armenia. I think in Armenia you have a perfect precondition for capacity building. You have a political will, you have a very open administration, you have the leadership is fully in line with what the EU asked for. So I think capacity building, even we start from a low level, should be rather easy. So maybe more compared to the situation in Moldova we had seen 4 or 5 years ago. And your second question, Sonia, was about?
Well, specifically about the role of the parliament and to what extent.
Oh yeah, we have picked up now the topic once again. So we will see a resolution and a plenary debate soon. I have started an initiative together with 3 other democratic groups in the parliament: Renew, S&D, and EPP. So we have lobbied for putting it on the agenda properly in March. We had hoped for an earlier debate, but it's very packed before the next European elections, but I think we're doing well too, and that is important. We have a lot of competing conflicts globally, regionally. So it's not just Ukraine, but it's the Western Balkan, it is of course Gaza, and a lot of attention drives away from the region. So for us to bring it back on the agenda in the European Parliament means also to bring back awareness and to ask the European leaders to focus, to invest, to put personnel and staff into the region and make sure that this initiative, which was started by Charles Michel and that's actually failed so far, maybe needs to be back on the agenda. As Ambassador Schübel has said, yes, we have seen some results in the last council, but nevertheless, since we have no real leverage against Aliyev, how can we force him to sign an agreement which he actually considers as completely useless? In the end, they will go for a military attack. It's more a question of when, and it's a question of where. But everyone who observes and watches the region is pretty sure that there will be an additional military attack coming from Azerbaijan. And how this to prevent from happening, I think the European Union has not found an answer yet. And that is, of course, rather frightening and worrying for the people in Armenia. So I think many things had happened, and I think we should appreciate that. On the civil sector, economic sector, many other also investment now, the support for the refugees, everything is on a good track, but the hardcore security is still pending, and I do not see that we have a proper solution which could satisfy the need of the people in Armenia.
Thank you very much, Viola. I know that you have to leave urgently. Maybe a final, very short question to you from Olesya Vartanyan, whether we should start thinking about a 3+1 format, the association trio, candidate countries plus Armenia. Is it time for that?
Absolutely. I mean, I was always against this new formats, but to be honest, to really adapt to the new situation in Armenia and also to the security situation in the region, I think we cannot wait for Azerbaijan. Of course, Belarus is out anyway. So I think this is the only format which should work and which should also encourage the Armenian leadership to be seen that they are not out of the trio, but they're actually like a quadro, yeah. So that is actually, as I see this for the last visits when I have been to the region, that Armenia is much more advancing compared to Georgia, and we should appreciate that. We should make sure that this institutional progress which Armenia has done is also echoed by the actions in the European Union, and I think this format could be one of the answers to this.
Thank you, Viola, and thank you for joining us. We will be happy if you join us again soon, and yeah, thank you for your support. We can't hear you.
I will listen, but I will disconnect the camera. So thanks a lot for having me. Thanks.
Thank you. We unfortunately have two more participants who have to leave soon. Ambassador Schübel and Ambassador Balayan also have very urgent commitments in Brussels. So I would like to ask you if you would like to provide some final remarks. You don't have to. There were some more questions in the Q&A, for example, on the 3+1 format, and also on whether the EU would be prepared for another potential attack, and how realistic it would be to aim for visa liberalization. Ambassador Schübel, I think you are getting ready to respond briefly.
Yes, I just had to find the mute button, the unmute button, but I found it. No, I think I agree with many points that both the ambassador made and also the member of the European Parliament, Ms. van Kamen, made. Fully agree on, I think on 3+1, I think we have de facto already 3+1, if we are honest to ourselves, because there are 3 countries moving with concrete decisions by the European Union in the direction of Europe. and Armenia does it without such concrete decisions so far. But once again, I think it is clear that the one is Armenia that is moving also into this direction. And of course, as I have tried to explain, all our support goes into this direction. For an official decision on this, there would be many probably meetings necessary and agreement by all 27. That I don't foresee in the near future. But as I said, in de facto we have already such format. So on other issues, I think there's not much more to add to what the ambassador said. European Parliament indeed is always on the forefront and has pushed us also in this way. But I think in the case of Armenia, we have seen how much Armenia is interested in increasing their contacts with us, and we have happily taken this on board, given also the decisions that have been taken. Prime Minister Pashinyan, indeed, brave decisions. I can only support what Ms. von Kramon said, that he took ICC, a very important decision that we very much appreciate, and that very much is not appreciated by one other big neighbor of Armenia. I think that's a good sign that it's not appreciated there. So security cooperation was mentioned, security dialogue I didn't mention, but the ambassador did. Very important indeed, and we will continue the security dialogue. Of course, we have security dialogues also with the other two countries of the Southern Caucasus. I think it is important to exchange this, to understand them, to understand each other better. So with that, perhaps I conclude. I didn't mention the report because I haven't read it yet, but I will read it, and I'm sure it is very good. Also, what was mentioned already by Anahida in the summary, that makes me even more interested, because I see some interesting points where we can also work on from our side, and rest assured that we will do. I'll stop here. I wish you a good continuation of the discussion, and once again, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Schübel. And without further ado, I would ask Marie Dumoulin for her patience and one more time.
Just jumping in on one last remark before I leave. Ambassador Schübel, thank you very much for this really encouraging words. And of course, I would like also to mention the, I would say, even the militant role of the European Parliament in advancing this partnership and proposing very concrete steps what has to be done. As concerns, the EU's future reactions on EAP, first of all, EAP. We want to keep EAP as it is, because we think that this is a good format for cooperation, for learning and exchanges. Also, this candidate tree, we need to learn the reforms, the way of the reforms and the pace of reforms from the candidate trio. So this we regard first and foremost EAP as a good format to be maintained. But we are against separating it into the groups, whatever it will look like. And let's see also, if we talk about the seriousness of EU's intentions and declaration, let's see to the reactions of EU and EU member states. So far, I saw only one reaction to the so-called sham elections yesterday held in Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much.
I have to run, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Balayan. And finally, last but not least, we move to Marie Dumoulin. A lot of interesting points have been raised already, so I won't ask any specific questions now. I'm sure there is enough to respond to about the report, priorities for EU-Armenia relations, visa liberalization, etc. And we can go more into detail afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have an easy task because so many things have already been said. I first wanted to thank you for organizing this important discussion. I also wanted to thank the authors of the report, because I thought it was really good. It's a really comprehensive review of all the instruments the EU has to work with Armenia, and with very concrete proposals of what the EU can do and what Armenia can do. So I really found it a very useful piece of analysis. Maybe a few words on what ECFR has done regarding EU-Armenia relations. We went to Armenia in October last year for a study trip, which we had planned for quite some time,
to try and see how Armenia's geopolitical environment and positioning was changing. We had been working before that on the efforts to normalize relationships between Armenia and Turkey. Obviously, the Armenia-Russia relationship was changing since 2020, and we also wanted to look at how echoes of the war in Ukraine were received in Armenia. So that was the general idea of our trip, but then the trip happened 2 weeks after Azerbaijan took control of Nagorno-Karabakh. So obviously, the focus of our trip and of our interviews changed quite a lot. So from this study trip, we brought back a couple of very general ideas of why the EU should care more about Armenia, but also what it could do. And I will probably conclude with a few remarks on the dilemmas that the EU is facing in its cooperation with Armenia. So first, why should the EU care? The previous speakers have all mentioned this is EU's direct neighborhood, and even more so since the EU has granted candidate status to Georgia. It's really our, it's next door. So that's one of the first reasons, I think. But it's also a matter of principle. If the EU stands for sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence in other parts of the world and not so far away from Armenia, if that's what we stand for in Ukraine, for example, that's also what we should stand for in Armenia. And that is really, I mean, we heard a lot in Armenia how concerned people were about a possible renewed aggression by Azerbaijan into the territory of Armenia proper. There are already a couple of areas where armed forces of Azerbaijan are on Armenian territory. What is at stake is really Armenia's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and this is what we should try to strengthen. The second point is it's a matter of credibility. If we stand for this in other parts of the world, not standing for Armenia's territorial integrity and sovereignty will diminish the credibility of our engagement in other parts of the world. And actors like Russia, Turkey, or others may think they have a carte blanche to do whatever they want, basically. And maybe one last point, and I think it was present in some of the things that were said, but I really want to put it very bluntly. It's a matter of geopolitical interest. All the connectivity projects that link Europe to Asia, when the route through Russia has been cut, they all go through this middle corridor that gives Azerbaijan and Turkey a key role in connecting Europe to Asia. So we cannot just let Azerbaijan monopolize this corridor without trying to diversify and include the whole South Caucasus in our connectivity projects. And even more so when we see an increasing cooperation between Azerbaijan and Russia on transport corridors. I really don't think we should give them the keys of our connections to Asia. So that said, what can the EU do? So on this, a whole lot has been said by previous speakers. I think the priority, and that has been very clearly said both by Anahida, but also by Ambassador Schubel and by Ambassador Balayan, the first priority is really to work on Armenia's state and society resilience, i.e. strengthening institutions, building up capacities, helping Armenia build a more inclusive society and economy, reduce its dependencies. So this has been very detailed, and it's very well presented in the report, so I will not elaborate further. The second thing, and that's related to the first point, is support Armenian security. So we now have the EU mission in Armenia on the border with Azerbaijan. That's a very important element. The EU has opened the possibility to use the European Peace Facility to work with Armenia. That's also a very welcome step. We do not need to think only in terms of weapon deliveries. And I agree with Viola von Kramon that what we can do on that for now is really very symbolic and not in the amounts that would be needed. But there are other areas where the EU can meaningfully work. On soft security, so countering hybrid threats, energy security, of course, but also, again, on building the capacities of the Armenian security ecosystem, working with the Defense Ministry on planning, also on reforming itself, training. This is thing that can be done without big logistical issues. And I think that's something on which Europeans have experience with. So why not do it also with Armenia? My last point on what the EU can do would be on the diplomatic side of things. The mediation efforts by the EU have been suspended because Azerbaijan is not willing to engage with Western actors on the negotiations. I really think we should use the leverage that we have, and I think Viola von Kramon said we don't have leverage. We do. We have one instrument to deter Azerbaijan from further aggression. That is the threat of restrictive measures, sanctions. And I really think we should make use of that instrument to tell Azerbaijan, if you infringe upon Armenia's territorial integrity, you will face consequences. But we also have incentives. All the connectivity projects that I mentioned earlier, these are investments also in Azerbaijan. And we could, I think we should be considering conditioning these investments to a more inclusive approach to these projects and including Armenia in all the connectivity projects that we are developing in the region. So with these two instruments, I hope we could try to reinsert some leverage of the EU, but also some diplomatic role of the EU in the negotiation process. And I would argue that what the EU can meaningfully focus on in this process is the question of borders, opening the borders, both with Azerbaijan, but also with Turkey, and making sure that borders work, and that there is a proper infrastructure in terms of connectivity so that Armenia can be included in the wider region. I think that would be one of the ways to reframe the discussion and have a meaningful role of the EU in that. One last point on the dilemmas that the EU is facing. Anahida said this earlier in her presentation. What the report describes are instruments that will have effects over the long term. But what Armenia is facing is urgent short-term security challenges. And on that, I don't know how the EU can help face these challenges with instruments that are meant to be effective over a longer term. Maybe one second dilemma is when we help Armenia diversify its options, reduce its dependencies, we should be careful not to increase Armenia's vulnerabilities. Russia has huge leverage over Armenia. Armenia is dependent in a very wide range of areas upon Russia. And so pushing Armenia to move away from Russia too fast may increase Armenia's vulnerability, because obviously that's not something Russia will like. So I really think we should be careful not to push Armenia to do things too quickly without having a sort of fallback option or certainty that it will not end up being more vulnerable than it already is. Which leads me to my last point, or almost. The last dilemma, I think, for the EU is to engage more with Armenia without creating expectations that it would not be able to live up to. And I think that's especially the case when we discuss reducing dependencies, but also when we discuss security. There are things the EU will not be able to do in the short term. And so we should not create the expectation that we will be. And maybe my very, very last part on all of this, I think one of the big dilemmas the EU is facing is its own lack of unity and the difficulty to build consensus inside the EU to move forward.
Thank you very much, Marie. That was very insightful and comprehensive. I have several follow-up questions, and also there are more questions coming in the Q&A tool. But maybe I first give the floor back to Anahid to maybe react to some of the points raised. And I think a very interesting question is, and somebody posed that question or comment in the tool. There's still a lot of work to explain what is the EU, or even what is the foreign policy of EU member states to Armenian citizens and the elite. Until recently, the focus was only on Russia, and there's a lot of biased views and misunderstandings. Media is also responsible. What is your impression, especially of the positioning within the expert community in Armenia? Is it positioning itself more pragmatically, also with regard to the question of increasing independence from Russia and moving towards the EU, or is it kind of a more idealistic view? How do you see this? But yeah, any other reflections are of course welcome as well.
Thank you, Sonia. A very tough act to follow these, interventions. The bar is very high, and I don't want to repeat what's been said, but try to complement it or give a bit more color from an Armenian expert perspective. Viola van Kramon described Nicole Pashinyan's standing as heroic, but I would very much highlight how vulnerable Armenia is, despite all these, quite bold statements or, actions that Armenia has done, and it shouldn't be underestimated. So I would very much echo what Marie said on being very mindful of Armenia's vulnerabilities and not trying to, make it Armenia more vulnerable. And actually, I think that when, positioning the ICC membership as an act against Russia, as we have seen publicly being done by the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. The only time she's tweeted about Armenia was twice, one of which was to say, this is great, Armenia has joined the ICC, this is against Russia. This is not, that was not actually the right framing. This is not about Russia. This is against your reliable partner in energy, so there's that. So there is this element, and for APRI Armenia, taking into account what the EU can do, cannot do, what it's saying and not doing, etc. Really, the path forward is diversification, and it's another way to say what the Ambassador Balayan said about a pivot towards Armenians' national interest, and also a recognition of where we are, on the map. And so really, what we've called in our report is diversification, building on the positive progress we're seeing with EU partners and American partners, but also embrace the emerging world order, multipolar order, where the BRICS or the global South in general is becoming more important, and it's something that we at APRI Armenia will be looking at more on India and the Arab world in particular, not just the traditional big powers. So really strengthening the idea of diversification is the right trajectory for Armenia's survival, rather than a pivot towards the full West without guarantees, as you mentioned, Marie. Your question on the Armenian expert community and the attitude. So the Armenian expert community is diverse, like in many places. The general topic of discussion is on security, and in particular, deciphering the role of UMA as part of the Armenia security architecture, and also looking at how the EU can help reduce its dependencies, Armenia's dependencies towards Russia. So there's lots of discussions about that. There's a cluster among the expert community seeing the strengthening of EU-Armenia relations as very positive, and they do identify it as a pivot away from Russia and towards the West. Some have a more nuanced perspective and others completely reject it. So you have a spectrum. But most of them, including those that are the most fervent supporters of and read what's happening as a pivot, would say that the EU can do more on the security side. We've mentioned this enough, so I don't need to repeat. But I would also highlight something that I think is very important, and I'm glad that we have members of the European expert community listening to this. I think a lot more can be done to bring the Armenian expert community closer to the European expert community. And I think it will really help both sides to be better informed. On one hand, the Armenians would have a much more real and nuanced understanding of the EU. And I hope also that the European experts will realize that Armenian experts are following closely what is happening. They're tracking the data, and they are worth listening to when it comes to regional stability. To give you a very concrete example, it was quite striking after the fallout of Nagorno-Karabakh. There were so many webinars organized by European institutions, American institutions, with no Armenian-based experts invited to speak, and so I think, more efforts can be put to also bring Armenian-based experts on these platforms and to give them voice. And so also, had the European expert community listened to the Armenian voices from civil society, from the think tanks or the media, they wouldn't have been surprised by what happened in September 2023. There were some people saying, oh, that was a surprise. Well, we have raised the red flags and you didn't, you'd ignore them. So I think there is a lot of work to be done actually on really enhancing the dialogue between the two. And of course, APRI Armenia stands ready for that. And I know that all the members of the Armenian expert community are too.
Thank you very much, Anahid. I briefly want to go through some of the questions in the Q&A tool. I think some of them have been already discussed, or answers to them have already been avoided. So probably we know the answer, but I will just briefly go through. So one question asks, is the EU prepared for the worst possible scenario, another Azerbaijani or major Azerbaijani attack on Armenian territory, and what can it do to prevent this? We have talked about potential sanctions. Marie has said that it would be important that the EU uses this tool, but also argued that or noted that there is, of course, the problem of finding consensus between the EU member states. Viola von Tramann has also talked about the problem of dependency on gas in this regard. Then it was asked, what other, and maybe we can talk a bit about that, what other instruments maybe the EU has for engagement in Azerbaijan. Marie has mentioned possible connectivity projects. Maybe it's worth also to talk about COP briefly, and the importance Azerbaijan attaches to this format. Could this be used somehow to push for positive progress? And then there are two questions about the European Peace Facility. What if Azerbaijan attacks before the assistance starts? And what if Azerbaijan refuses to withdraw from the areas it occupies in Armenia currently? How will the EU react? And regarding the EPF, I, in my opinion, and I'm abusing my role as a moderator here, but that's again a question of expectation management, because probably even if assistance starts before an attack, this will not defend Armenia, because this is not the assistance that would be required for like a major defense effort. Nonetheless, I would like to hand back to Marie Dumoulin, and maybe you could also touch upon this visa liberalization, a question that we had earlier, and the alleged French reservations. From a French perspective, maybe do you know of any discussions about that in French, in French politics or in the administration? Would be good to know. Thank you.
Thank you. I must say I haven't discussed the topic with French officials recently. So what I will say is builds on what I know of French positions regarding visa liberalization generally. I mean, visa liberalization is not an unequivocal question. So first of all, you have several institutions involved in handling this issue. It's the case in France, but I guess it's the case in Germany and other EU countries too. You have ministries of interior and ministries of foreign affairs. That's the two main stakeholders. And sometimes they have different visions. Usually ministries of foreign affairs will say that's a good way to increase relationship, anchor the country more with the EU, facilitate travels and exchanges. And ministries of interior are usually more careful about migration risks. Which means they usually have a more restrictive approach to that. And that was the case, for example, in discussions about visa liberalization with Kosovo. France was not approving for a very long time, and that was very much because the Ministry of Interior was careful about migration risks. That said, I think, well, I guess ministries of interior usually see that from the point of view of the receiving country of migrations, but I think they have a point also for the other country. Hurrying too much with visa liberalization without working on local development, inclusive economies, etc., risks basically encouraging brain drain from the countries concerned, and that's something we've seen in a lot of Western Balkan countries, where you had a huge waves of emigration when visa liberalization was opened, and that had a huge impact on local economies. So I don't want to say, I don't know whether the Interior Ministry is blocking on this issue in France, and what the general position is specifically on Armenia. But I can imagine that this kind of thinking is also at stake, that France may be thinking not only of migration risks for itself, but also of what it will mean for Armenian society if all of a sudden the possibility to travel visa-free to the EU is opened. That doesn't mean it will not happen. That basically means that opening the discussions will require some preparation. And usually discussions about visa liberalization are not quick, to say the least.
Thank you very much. Anahit, would you also like to respond?
Yes, I'm happy to. I understand, I really understand the arguments that Marie has put forward to assume, why this reluctance. I can see from personal experience, however, how hard it is and actually affecting your dignity, to apply for visas. And actually it can obstruct business-to-business engagement, people-to-people engagement, expert-to-expert engagement. Concretely, you're invited to a conference to speak, but you can't because you had to make an appointment 6 months ago. I'm exaggerating, So I think, there may be measures to actually mitigate these concerns of brain drain and, to just make it easier and, and more appreciative of the timings on, for the visa liberalization process. So that would be the only things I have to say. Sonia.
Thank you. Okay, then maybe just one more question to Marie, also in light of another question that we have just received on foreign policy consensus and how it can be worked out better in the European Union. I think it would be interesting to know your views on how the EU might change after the upcoming European Parliament elections and whether this could affect Armenia, particularly in light of the rise of the far right. If you know what positions they have expressed towards Armenia and also how a potentially different commission maybe affect EU-Armenia relations, if at all.
Okay, that's a difficult one. First of all, because we don't know what the outcome of the election will be, but also because foreign policy issues are still very much a matter of national decisions by member states. So this is where the consensus should be built. It's among national governments rather than at the European Parliament. The European Parliament, of course, can help build that consensus, and it should do so. But ultimately, decisions on foreign policy issues will be made by the Council, i.e. by the member states. So the impact of EU parliamentary elections will be very indirect. It will basically depend on how national governments interpret the outcome of the elections in each member state. Now, if I take the example I know best, my home country, France, but it's probably not the best example when it comes to Armenia, because it has a very specific position. In France, polls show a very high score for extreme right-wing parties. So that will probably have a consequence on national politics. Whether it will have a consequence in foreign policy issues, generally, I am not so sure. And specifically on Armenia, I don't think so, if only because Rassemblement National is also very supportive of Armenia for specific reasons that have to do with its civilizational vision of the world and the support to a small Christian country in a Muslim-dominated environment, to put it very briefly. But I don't think that Rassemblement National will be critical of engagement with Armenia, quite the contrary. But again, it's a very specific situation given France's positions on Armenia. I don't know how it will influence positions in other member states. I think what makes consensus difficult is also the various interests member states have in the region. And specifically on one issue that Viola von Kramon mentioned, the energy deliveries from Azerbaijan. Some member states buy a lot of gas from Azerbaijan, some much less. And that also influences their relationship to Azerbaijan and thus what they are ready to accept in terms of EU decisions towards Azerbaijan. Sorry, I was a bit long.
Not at all. Thank you. Okay, I think we
Can
are.
I give
Sure.
my perspective?
Mm-hmm.
So on the elections, yes, I think a national read is important, but it's also interesting to look at the parties' result through their stance towards the EU. So Rassemblement National is also, quite skeptical of the EU versus others that are, more pro-EU. So basically, we also need to read the results of the elections in June as to what there is skepticism towards the EU as a political project, or whether citizens are still, optimistic about the EU. So that will be an interesting, thing to look at. But that goes back to what Marie said, that in the end, foreign policy are decisions made by national governments or the capitals. And so more effort should be put on that. And again, it's one of the recommendations we make, for example, that Armenia should engage with these member states that are, more reluctant to taking a stronger stance against Azerbaijan or in favor of Armenia. So, and it's also something we can do at the expert community level too. You mentioned also, again, that some member states, particularly in the southern part, are reliant on gas, on Azerbaijani gas. Well, if we take a picture, it is maximum 6% of the gas supply that the EU has, so it's very interesting to see the contrast. But it does create a two-speed Europe, even on green energy or generally on energy within the EU. And if I were the EU, I would be quite worried about this two-speed Europe when it comes to domestic energy use, and work much more to try to make these southern countries less reliant on fossil fuels, and work much more to accelerate the investments in renewable energy.
Thank you very much, Anahid. And actually, this is something I also wanted to stress. So I'm pleased that the discussion moved in the direction of green foundations' primary interests. I agree that it's a big issue that several member states are especially dependent or importing much more gas from Azerbaijan than others. And this points towards the need for a stronger green transformation in the EU as a whole, to become more independent from fossil fuel imports, but also especially in those countries affected. But at the same time, we see also that the Green Deal and the EU's green policy is also under threat, not only from the far right, but also more from the center. So in this regard, we also have to be very cautious and wait for the election results. Last point before I will give you a very short question to finish with. There was one more comment on that Armenia has also to be serious about commitments on human rights issues and the implementation of what was agreed. The EU, neither the EU nor anyone else will do the homework for Armenia in this regard. And I think this is an important comment that I wanted to highlight, especially also because more recently, many of our partners have been alarmed by the opening of a gold mine finally in Armenia, and potential environmental impacts of that, and also lawsuits against activists in this regard. So this is definitely something to also keep an eye on, and thank you for emphasizing this. Okay, final 2 minutes, so 1 minute each. Your number one priority for EU-Armenia relations 2024.
I will start. I think if I had to give one piece of advice on what the EU and Armenia should do in 2024 is to work on the strategic communications, really focusing on explaining what it is that they can offer each other and to the citizens. I know there was a question around this, so I agree. Armenian citizens, they do need to understand, not just the experts, the citizens too, they need to understand what the EU is about, what it can or cannot do when it comes to security, what is the EUMA all about. What we hear in Armenia is what the EUMA isn't, not what it is. So it's so there's a lot of work that and efforts can be put on really educating, informing the general public about the EU. And I think also Armenia should also tell the EU much more clearly where it can be a solution provider and being very realistic and concrete in giving examples and why it matters again, really as the world order is changing.
Thank you, Anahit. And finally, Marie.
Yeah, I will go back to what is in the report and the whole work on governance, strengthening institutions, working towards a more inclusive economic system. I think these are really issues on which the EU has expertise and can work with the Armenian government to make sure that at least there is a functioning, resilient state and society. That whatever the strategic and security environment.
Thank you. We have come to the end of this webinar, and I would like to thank our speakers, of course, but also our attendees for attending, and I hope you found the webinar as interesting as I did. We will definitely follow up and continue working on EU-Armenia relations, EU-Germany relations, and we'll keep you updated on our activities. So thank you again for joining, for your questions, and we will also upload a recording of the webinar soon. Thank you and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.